Male pattern baldness is something men have experienced throughout history, and Roman history is no different. This video aims to give an account of how this phenomenon affected Roman emperors and how the literary sources reacted to it. Although he was not a Roman emperor, I will cover Julius Caesar. Never mind being the most famous bald Roman, Caesar is probably one of the most famous bald historical figures. Our information about Caesar's hair, or lack thereof, comes from Suetonius, who states that Caesar was greatly troubled by his baldness and that he used to comb hair forward from the back of his head to cover his bald scalp. This technique is quite visible on coinage that bears Caesar's portrait. In the adversarial, rhetorical environment of the Roman Senate, any flaws were ruthlessly exploited, and Suetonius confirms that Caesar's detractors did indeed seize upon his hair loss. Suetonius relates that the Senate allowed Caesar to wear a laurel wreath, and this greatly pleased him due to it obscuring his hair loss. The use of the laurel wreath in Caesar's portraits on coins shows how this technique could be somewhat effective. The Tusculum bust, the only bust from Caesar's lifetime, shows his advanced degree of hair loss and is without a laurel wreath to hide it. Suetonius also tells us that during the traditional act of mocking triumphant generals, Caesar's soldiers made fun of his baldness and referenced the fact that he engaged in various romances and spent a lot of money during his time in Gaul. We can see from the coin where Caesar is called dictator for life that neither Caesar nor the engravers made any attempt to idealise Caesar's appearance despite him holding supreme power. The Arley bust, found in the Rhone River, is speculated to be a bust of Julius Caesar from the time of his campaigns in Gaul. However, this identification encounters strong opposition. Probably to the delight of Caesar's senatorial opponents, his name may even derive from a word meaning hairy. There are various interpretations of the name Caesar put forward by the Historia Augusta, but only one is corroborated by the Lexicon of Festus. This work states that the name derives from a famous ancestor of the Julii being born with a full head of hair. The bust on this slide shows how after Caesar's death and deification, sculptors hid many of his perceived flaws, including his hair loss. Our next subject is the Emperor Gaius Caligula, who reportedly dealt with severe hair loss. Suetonius is again our source for this. Suetonius tells us that Caligula was so insecure about his hair that if people had particularly fine heads of hair, he would order the backs of their heads shaved to make them look ridiculous. Furthermore, apparently mentioning goats or looking down upon his bald head was made a capital offence. Caligula is not represented as bald on his coinage, except occasionally with some very slight frontal recession and a mild comb-over. However, his forehead does get suspiciously large in some issues, which may be interpreted as some sort of artistic compromise from the engravers. His busts show him with a full head of hair. Our next bald emperors come as a double act, as both were party to the year of the 4 emperors. Galba is described as very bald by Suetonius, and some of Galba's coinage betrays this fact. However, other issues of Galba's coinage show him as a young soldiery man, with a full head of hair. This is very contrary to Suetonius' grim account of him. Apparently, Otho removed all of his body hair and adorned himself with a wig due to the thinness of the hair on his scalp. The wig is quite plain to see in some of Otho's coins, although Suetonius states that it was imperceptible in person. The next emperor we will cover is the entire Flavian dynasty. All 3 of these emperors experienced some degree of pattern hair loss. Vespasian, being quite old when he became emperor, is almost completely bald on the top of his head, and this is apparent on both sculpture and coinage. However, Suetonius, often so keen to bring this up about other emperors, fails to do so for Vespasian. Perhaps it was because Vespasian simply didn't care about this and accepted his hair loss, making any attack from this direction a waste of time. Suetonius, in fact, preserves an anecdote about Vespasian, wherein Vespasian asks a witty man in his presence to make a joke about him too. The man replies that he will, once Vespasian has finished defecating, a reference to Vespasian's strained and wrinkled appearance. There is no account of any repercussions for this man, so we can assume that Vespasian enjoyed poking fun at himself. Another possible explanation is that Vespasian was a good emperor who was deified upon his death, and Suetonius did not want to engage in petty attacks against such a man. It's worth noting that Vespasian's hair does not improve on his deification coinage after his death, as can be seen on the right-hand side coin on this slide. In fact, in Decius's deification series that was produced some 150 years later, Vespasian's hair even gets worse. When Vespasian died, he was succeeded by his son Titus, who clearly inherited the trait of his pattern baldness, but it had not advanced to the same degree as his father. Titus's receding and thinning hair is present on his coins, and some sculptures of him when he is middle-aged. Again, Suetonius makes no mention of Titus's hair, probably for similar reasons as his father. Although Titus is not recorded to have joked about his appearance, he was apparently very friendly and enjoyed a good time and revelry. so it wouldn't be surprising if he was also quite relaxed about his hair. Titus was also deified upon his death. Titus's deification coinage still shows him with receded hair. Curiously, in Decius's deification series, Titus's hairline appears somewhat restored, contrary to the treatment Vespasian received. Domitian, the other son of Vespasian who succeeded Titus, was also balding. Suetonius comments on this at length. Unlike his father and brother, Domitian was disliked by Suetonius and other members of the Roman elite and was not made a god upon his death. Domitian was also reportedly paranoid and uptight. Suetonius' treatment of Domitian's baldness is compelling. Suetonius paints a picture of an insecure Domitian, yet notes that Domitian wrote a book about hair care. He also notes a witty remark Domitian wrote, in which Domitian quotes Achilles from the Iliad when he's consoling his enemy Lycaon, who is begging for mercy. Achilles questions why Lycaon is lamenting so much, by pointing out that everyone dies, and that even Achilles will die too, despite him being tall and comely, and born from a goddess. Domitian is making play on the fact that his divine lineage from the deceased emperors and reported handsome appearance are not enough to spare his hair from death. After Domitian is assassinated, the poet Juvenal notes Domitian's baldness and comments on his tyrannical reign, calling him the bald Nero. We can see from Domitian's coins that his hair is quite weak when he is Caesar, these coins being produced during the time of the more realistic portraiture of his father and brother. However, once Domitian is Augustus, his coins become quite idealised, and as a result he is provided extra hair and makes clever use of the laurel wreath. Domitian's sculptures show no signs of baldness. The last emperor whose baldness is explicitly presented is Carus. A story related to his baldness is preserved about him, although it's incorrectly attributed to his son Carinus, who had a full head of hair. The tale states that Carus conversed with a Persian embassy and pointed to his bald head and threatened that he would lay waste to Persia and make it bare in like manner. Carus did in fact sack the Persian capital of Ctesiphon, making good on his word. This story is preserved by Synesius, a Neoplatonist turned Christian bishop, in his speech on imperial rule to the Emperor Arcadius. We will meet Synesius again later. Carus appears unapologetically bald on his coins, but does occasionally wear a helmet. This was not to cover his baldness, however, but was instead the fashion on coins at the time. There is a bust of the bald Carus, but as with many busts in the late Roman Empire, the identification is somewhat tenuous. Carus was also deified after his death, but as with previous emperors, his deification coinage does not improve his hairline. This next slide covers a few miscellaneous details about imperial baldness. Starting from the top left, we have Gordian I and his son Gordian II, who were emperors for under a month during the 3rd century crisis. The interesting thing about these emperors is that the elder Gordian on the left is depicted with a full hairline, and the younger Gordian on the right is depicted with advanced baldness. This is fascinating due to the hereditary nature of male pattern baldness. Gordian II should probably blame his mother for this result. Moving to the right, we have Trajan Decius, a mid-3rd century emperor who is depicted on both sculpture and coinage with a receded hairline. This is the emperor responsible for the deification series that contained Vespasian and Titus. On the bottom left, we have 2 gold coins of Probus. The coin on the left is a more realistic depiction, which seems to show that Probus has experienced a degree of hairline recession and was combing his hair over at the front. As Probus's coins become more stylised, as shown on the coin on the right, his full hairline is restored. Finally, on the bottom right, we have what was purported to be a bust of an elderly Trajan, the Optimus Princeps, near the end of his life. We can see this bust shows some significant frontal recession and combing forward of the remaining hair. However, this bust is no longer identified with the Emperor Trajan, but instead is identified as a noble from Asia Minor, who happens to look a bit like him. Now for some considerations. There doesn't seem to be any association with baldness and any particular attribute. We have great and popular men like Caesar, Vespasian and Titus. We have an excellent but unpopular man in Domitian. We have an absolutely depraved individual in Caligula. There's incompetence such as Decius. There are also some usurpers, and also a military emperor of the 3rd century. One may notice that a significant amount of Suetonius' 12 Caesars are bald, yet the proportion of bald emperors drops off quite fast after this. What could be the reasons? My speculation is that the available sources talking about other emperors are less contemporary and also contain a lower amount of trivial gossip compared to Suetonius. Furthermore, we don't have other forms of evidence for later emperors' hair as it actually was in reality, due to the increasing tendency towards idealised portraits as time went on, which precluded showing signs of ageing such as hair loss, even as emperors became quite elderly. One last thing I will note is that on some coin issues of so-called bald emperors, they do appear to have a full hairline. Ultimately, this is due to variation among engravers, and in the late Roman period, issues from different mints. Now that we have broadly discussed the appearance of emperors, let's talk about the literary scene and how it relates to baldness. In the work The Satyricon by Petronius, dated to the time of Nero, the irritating and degenerate yet comedic poet character Eumolpus waxes about baldness and notes that the speed with which the gods can remove the blessing of one's hair should prepare people for the way death can steal a person away. During the reigns of Domitian, Trajan and Nerva, the poet Martial produced a series of epigrams. Some of these epigrams insult bald people, with my favourite being the one addressed to Labinos. In this epigram, Martial jokes that the bald scalp with hair on the sides makes Labinos look like 3 people, and as a result, he received 3 times as many gifts on Saturnalia. Martial elaborates on this point, stating that Labinos better watch out for Hercules as he resembles the 3-headed monster Hieron. Generally, Martial seems to take issue with people who don't admit to their baldness and thus don't embrace who they really are, instead combing their hair over or applying dyes and wigs. Rather interestingly, Book 5 of the Epigrams is dedicated to Domitian and contains one of the poems insulting bald people. Various medical authors espoused cures for baldness. However, the early 1st century Encyclopedia of Medicine by Celsus noted that pattern baldness due to increasing age had no cure. Now it's time for the return of Synesius. Rather than a serious address to the ruling emperor, this time, Synesius is engaging in playful rhetorical exercise with his work In Praise of Baldness. This work is a playful response to another work called In Praise of Hair by the famous rhetorician Dio Chrysostomos. Dio lived during the Flavian and Nerva-Antonine dynasties, about 300 years before Synesius. Synesius quotes Dio's work at length, and Dio mainly uses arguments based on Homer and Homer's description of heroes. Synesius was bald himself, and also greatly admired Dio, so the response is done jovially and with self-awareness. Synesius' work is very funny, but also very lengthy, therefore I will share my favourite portions. Synesius makes the point that hairy animals like sheep are the most stupid, and the more hairless, such as humans, are the most intelligent. He also says that of all human sense faculties, sight is the most divine, and also the least hairy. He points out that all the most intelligent people, namely philosophers, are bald. He says that you can go and see sculptures of Socrates and Diogenes, who are both bald. Although we know what Socrates looked like, an actual account or representation of Diogenes' appearance eludes us, but it seems traditionally that he was certainly thought of as bald. Synesius compares hair with lifeless pods, and comments how revered Egyptian priests therefore shave their heads as to not construe death and decay with the divine. He then states that if it's pious to shave one's head, isn't the naturally bald truly connected with the divine? Furthermore, he states that the bald head is spherical, the sphere being thought of as the most divine of shapes in the Platonic tradition. Synesius later makes reference to the baldness of the divine Egyptian Asclepios, or Imhotep, who is purported to be the inventor of medicine. He notes how Imhotep, the most knowledgeable about health, is depicted as bald, and that anyone who wishes to be healthy should seek to imitate him. Next, Synesius says that depictions of the gods with hair are incorrect, and were only done to placate mobs of simpletons. He states that if Homer, or anyone else, were to depict the gods as hairless and divine as they actually are, then they would be forced to drink hemlock, like Socrates was. Synesius then shares 2 empirical anecdotes, the first in which Herodotus surveys the skeletons of a battle, and notes that the skulls belonging to the Egyptians who shaved their heads from youth appeared much harder than those of the Medes. This anecdote is actually found in Herodotus, and is not invented by Synesius. Herodotus theorizes that sun exposure makes a person's skull harder. The next anecdote is a rather hilarious personal one. Synesius explains that there is a man at the theatre who has a head incredibly resistant to pain and physical force. He butts heads with a ram, cracks vases on it, and puts burning pitch on it. Synesius states that this man shaves his head bald to aid in the hardening process. Synesius states that as a bald man, he himself could also accomplish these feats, but he just doesn't need or want to. Lastly, Synesius argues that bald heads are useful in combat, as they imitate the terrifying sight of a helmet. He further makes the etymological connection between the Greek word for cranium and helmet. Synesius' work contains more arguments, the fullness of which I could not labour on in this video. One last thing I wish to comment on before this video wraps up is an anecdote related to baldness that exemplifies the need to be mindful of primary sources. There's a story going round the web that Cleopatra VII of Egypt attempted to cure Caesar's baldness. I looked round and round for the primary source of this event and could only find vague references to Galen. Using this clue, I consulted some scholarly literature only to find that this story is a hilariously far-fetched extrapolation. It turns out that Galen quotes a work called the Cosmeticos by a certain Cleopatra, which contains various antidotes to hair loss. However, Galen makes no mention that this Cleopatra is the Queen of Egypt, and scholars speculate that it was simply a physician with the same name. Obviously, Galen does not tell any story about Caesar's baldness either then, so it seems that this common myth, present in everywhere from blogs to news sources to educational and academic websites, is a case of someone misinterpreting a small piece of evidence and crafting a false but compelling story out of it. Thank you for listening, and well done if you made it this far. This video ended up being significantly longer than I anticipated.